I should also stress that in addition to what's in all the documentation the OBR produces, the OBR's whole ethos is to just be responsive and transparent when asked questions about its forecast. Our principle when I was there and also under my predecessor was, if we've got the information, and we have it somewhere in the building and somewhere in our system, people want to know it, we will disclose it, unless there's some legal reason why we can't. Either it discloses confidential taxpayer information or something about policy under development. And then thirdly, and lastly, I think the contribution that the OBR has made to improving the analysis of the risks around the OBR's central forecast over the medium term through the use of sensitivities, scenarios, through much of my time, because we were forecasting either in the midst of COVID or in the midst of an energy shock. It was really important to understand what would different paths for the virus mean for the economy and public finances, what could different trajectories for energy prices mean for the economy and public finances. I think exploring those scenarios in a way which I think governments can be reluctant to, because they always want to give a sort of deterministic view of the future, and they struggle to engage with a range of scenarios because they don't always have a plan for every scenario. I think what the OBR does is underscore the uncertainty around its medium-term forecast and the need to take account of the fact that the world might turn out to be very different from what's in the central forecast. And then secondly, in our fiscal sustainability and risks reports, we extend that work all the way to a 50-year horizon and look at the sustainability of the public finances over much longer periods, and not just look at what that means in the aggregate, but dig down into sort of what are some of the key things that might drive public spending up, tax revenues down, deficits up, debt up, be it the aging of the population, be it the trajectory for health-related inactivity, be it upward pressures on defence spending. So I think by bringing more attention to those issues of risk and sustainability, I think the OBR has also just enriched the public debate about the direction of fiscal policy.
Thank you for that. I just want to follow up with a couple of small things. You rightly mentioned the fiscal risks work you do, fiscal risk and sustainability document. We've heard from various witnesses that they wish that the long-term work you do in that document got more profile, because obviously the OBR is always in the spotlight for the assessment, the annual assessment of fiscal compliance of the government, but less so when it does the fiscal risks and sustainability report. Can you think of any way in which the system of responding to the OBR could help to elevate the issues that you raise in those reports on a regular basis?
Well, I think part of the answer is just to keep banging on about it, sort of Kevin Costner style. If you kind of build it in due course, the kind of discussion and policy making will kind of start to address the issues that you highlight. I think one thing which we did during my tenure at the OBR was try to make the fiscal risk and sustainability report not just a scary headline number, but have a set of thematic chapters which dig down much more deeply into a set of sustainability issues, be they around health-related inactivity, be they around climate change and net zero, looking into different demographic scenarios, looking at geopolitical risks. And so I think those help to just draw attention to a set of discrete areas where there is the potential and possibly the need to actually address policy. I do think that this committee and the Treasury Committee, by holding regular hearings on the Risk and Sustainability Report, have made a really big contribution to drawing attention to that work. When I started out, that we had hearings about the EFOs, but not hearings about the FRS. And I think that's definitely helped bring attention to those areas, those issues around risks and sustainability. I think one thing which could be explored is whether you're just looking at the level of debt in 2070 and the trajectory for the deficit in 2070 provides enough kind of richness to what unsustainability means when you look at fiscal policy. You could look at sort of what would you have to do to the basic rate of income tax in order to bring the deficit toward a more sustainable position if you don't get those spending pressures under control? What would it mean if you let debt interest rise up to 12% of GDP? What would that mean for how much you'd have left to spend on education and health and other things if you wanted to keep the tax burden unchanged? So I think illustrating the sort of choices and trade-offs that an unsustainable fiscal position might force on the country would also be one way of perhaps bringing home those messages. But I think finally, a real challenge that you don't have with the EFO, which is that the government produces a forecast and the policy response is the budget. With the FRS, the OBR produces the FRS, and the government's response to it has become kind of increasingly cursory over time. When I the first time the Treasury produced a response to the first FRS, which was back in 2017. There was an over 100-page document produced by the Treasury talking about how it was going to address the issues raised in the FRS. Most recently, the Treasury response has been 19 pages, I think, and in a written statement to Parliament. And so the fact that there's not a comprehensive response from government, there's no parliamentary debate on the floor of Parliament about the FRS, the way there is an extensive debate about the budget. I think it's great that that yourselves and the Treasury Committee do draw attention to that report, but for the moment, that's the extent of parliamentary attention brought to it.
Very interesting, thank you. One other follow-up. I wanted to ask you specifically about the letter you sent at the end of the budget process, which got a lot of attention. The letter you sent to the Treasury clarifying the public letter, clarifying the timeline of interaction between the OBR and the Treasury in the run-up to the budget. Could you just set out to the committee why you sent that letter? And presumably it was in response to some elements of the process that you'd found unsatisfactory or needed clarification for future rounds of OBR Treasury interaction. Could you explain what those unsatisfactory elements were that you were seeking to draw attention to?
Sure. The first thing I should say is that the OBR doesn't discuss the content of its forecasts with the media or anybody else outside the OBR. Or the Treasury or departments involved in preparation of the forecast in the run-up to budget day. But there had been in the run-up to this last budget in the autumn an unusual volume of speculation. And to some extent, there's always speculation about what the government's going to do with policy, and it's natural that government's having consultations with industry and with business and other places, and so the nature of those discussions get out and people understand there are policies under development. This was the first time in my 25 years working in fiscal policy making in the UK and other places that the volume of speculation about the content of the OBR's forecast was that great and that persistent. And I'd become concerned that could create a damaging impression about the professionalism and integrity of the OBR in the way in which it conducts the preparation of its forecast. And I think in particular about three perceptions which seem to be doing the rounds. One was that the OBR had somehow been fickle and changeable in the judgments it had been making about the economic outlook, and that was driving volatility in the policy-making process. I think a second concern that I had was around a very specific set of stories about how the OBR's forecast had changed at the very last minute after we closed our pre-measures forecast, and that had somehow prompted the government to abandon its plans to raise income tax. And third, that also the OBR had somehow colluded with the Treasury around setting the window for the interest rates that we used in our medium-term forecast, and that we'd chosen a window for interest rates that was particularly fiscally favourable to the government because that had been a period where expectations for gilt yields and bank rate had been falling. None of those three things were remotely true. We had taken all the decisions, main decisions we took in that forecast about both the downgrade to productivity but also the offsetting effects that there'd been in higher rates of inflation, higher real wage growth at the outset of the forecast. Actually, the variation at the bottom line of our fiscal forecast was remarkably small between the first round and the final pre-measures round of our forecast. The variation was a few billion to the bottom line, which by the standards of previous forecasts I'd worked on was a very small amount of variation. We were used to, we were doing forecasts. And in the middle of it, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine and energy prices quadrupled. And those are just the sorts of things which is in the nature of forecasting. We have a very turbulent external environment, a volatile domestic environment, and so you have to deal with those kind of variations. In this particular exercise, there was really none of that, and so it was not the case that variation in the OBR's judgments was driving policy. And in particular, we didn't make any changes to our pre-measures forecast after the 31st of October. And so changes thereafter were not made to the pre-measures forecast and don't explain decisions that have been made on policy. And finally, the decision that we took about the interest rate window we used for the forecast, those decisions have been taken over the summer. And we'd informed the Treasury of that decision in early September at a time when neither we nor the Treasury could have known whether that window was going to be especially auspicious or inauspicious for the public finances. So I thought it was also important to clear up any misconception that we had somehow done the Treasury a favour in the last minutes to help alleviate fiscal pressures in that way. Conscious that we were going to get all those questions on budget day, given the amount of speculation about them and the stories in the media, I'd informed the Treasury that I planned to write to the chair of the TSC, got the Treasury's agreement to publish the letter. I'd intended to send it on budget day, but given the events that then subsequently happened with the inadvertent release of the EFO itself, I felt it was more important to prioritise our communications with the TSC around how we were addressing that much more important problem. When the chair of the TSC asked me for a copy of the letter on the 20th of November, I sent it on.
I see. Okay. Thank you very much. Did you want a quick follow-up on this, Alison?
I did have one quick follow-up because you said, and that's certainly I think been our impression too, that the volume of speculation and discussion in the lead up to this budget was just was sort of all proportion to previous years. Do you have any sense of why that was, and whether there were any sort of long-term aspects to it, or whether it was just a function of a particular state of politics last autumn?
I don't know. I think part of it may just reflect the fact that people are coming to understand better and better the work of the OBR and its interactions with the Treasury. I think in some ways, people have a better sense of what happens at different stages. The fact that we published a timetable for the preparation of the forecast, which we started doing after a previous round of speculation about how we'd move the dates of things around to make it convenient to the Chancellor. That was one of the reasons why we chose to be more transparent about the timetable, was that there'd been a previous accusation that we'd somehow chosen particular dates to be particularly favourable, and so we wanted to make it clear that, look, we set these dates at the outset, here they are, including the most key date is when we close the pre-measures forecast round, because then in effect we're closing it to new data from the macroeconomy. So out of a desire for transparency and accountability, we started publishing the timetable for the forecast. I think that's provided a set of hooks for people, for journalists then to ask questions, to which, one option is just to not answer them and say, well, there's nothing to tell you about the OBR's round 2 or round 3 or round 4 forecast. How we've got into a world where those questions are suddenly being answered, or at least speculated about by some people, I don't know.
Thank you very much. Lord Agnew.
Yes, good afternoon. Welcome back. I've got a couple of questions on the bond markets. The first question is, do markets really care about government meeting the fiscal rules? It's interesting, in the previous evidence session we've had two almost completely conflicting versions, one referring to France that's been flaunting its rules for nearly 8 years without any consequence, but I'd be very interested to hear your view.
Well, I'm not a market participant, but I have observed how markets have responded to the government's fiscal policies, both here but also in other countries where I've worked. I think that you heard from market participants when you had them before you, Rupert and Sanjaya, that I do think markets welcome having a clear articulation of the government's fiscal objectives and the transparency the OBR provides about whether governments are on track to meet those fiscal objectives. And in a previous life, when I was working at the IMF, and we'd do these kind of big cross-country empirical studies about the impact of things like fiscal rules and fiscal councils, we tended to find that if you had kind of well-designed fiscal rules and well-designed fiscal councils, that led to sort of both better fiscal outcomes and also lower borrowing costs for the countries concerned. I think we've had our own natural experiments here in the UK back in the autumn of 2022, when we abandoned both fiscal rules and the fiscal forecasting function that the OBR provides, and that led to quite a big and large and adverse market reaction, and contributed to what was an increase in bond spreads of up to 100 basis points at its peak in the aftermath of the so-called mini budget. And I think it was also telling that kind of once those institutions were turned back on, and the government re-established some fiscal rules and brought the OBR back into the process for forecasting it, that those spreads against US Treasuries and German bonds more or less disappeared, at least for a time. So I do think that markets value a clear statement of government's fiscal objectives. I do think they value the transparency that the OBR provides about the outlook for the public finances. And while it's true that countries like France have lower borrowing costs than ours, I mean, they're under a great deal of fiscal stress, and their borrowing costs have been rising. And I think it's always tricky to compare the UK with other countries that are within the Eurozone, because to some extent they have a backstop in their bond market provided by the European Central Bank, and they also have the sort of disciplining power of being part of the Eurozone and the European system, where there are other instruments that impose fiscal discipline, whereas when you're outside that system, you've got to create those constraints for yourself. and we don't. The government here doesn't have the kind of backstop that Eurozone countries have clearly been demonstrated to have had by recent crises.
I think in an earlier session with us, you mentioned that there'd been a tremendous number of changes to the fiscal rules over the last 15 years. I think it may have been as many as 10 changes. So doesn't that make a slight mockery of the process, and has it changed the way the bond markets view our behaviour fiscally?
Well, I do think the UK is very unusual in the number of fiscal rules it's had. I mean, we were early pioneers in fiscal rules back in 1997 when we first adopted them. But since then, I think the average shelf life of a fiscal rule in the UK is 2.8 years. And that goes back to 97. If you take it from 2010, the average fiscal rule is around for about 1.8 years. So I don't think we should be terribly surprised that fiscal rules are not binding on fiscal outcomes. They tend to not be around long enough. And I also, it's not since 2005 that I'm pretty sure any fiscal rule has actually been around long enough for it to be assessed in outturn. It was always being assessed in prospect. And more recently, the fiscal rules we've had are only assessable in prospect, right? Because they're always about what's going on in the forecast rather than what's going on in outturn. So I do think both the lack of permanence that fiscal rules have had in the UK has meant that we shouldn't be surprised that they're not particularly binding 4, 5, 6, 10 years ahead, because they're very likely to be changed. And the fact that they always have this rolling nature means that even if the objective of the rule is to get the current budget into balance, you've always got a few years to get there. And so those rolling rules always provide a constant excuse for not making progress toward your final destination. And I mean, for example, at the moment we've got a deficit of around 5% of GDP at the moment. The government's objective is to get it down to 2.5%. But that objective at the moment is not being met for another 4 years. That'll eventually become 3, but even so, I mean, the government can repeatedly show a plan for getting to its objective without ever getting there under the rules that we've got.
Thank you very much.
Lord Lamont.
Could I follow up on some of the questions that were raised earlier about the pre-budget situation? On the 14th of November, the Treasury briefed that it was rowing back on what it had previously briefed on the 4th of November about proposed possible income tax increases. Professor Miles, when he appeared before the Treasury Select Committee, said, "I think our concern was that there seemed to be a misconception that there had somehow been some good news, because I think the Treasury briefing had referred to better news." Was that a misconception? Perhaps you could comment on that. And secondly, the Chancellor of the Exchequer repeatedly saying before the budget that the productivity review had downgraded productivity, and this meant lower tax increases. But was the productivity review not meant to be delivered in confidence to the Treasury?
On the first question, we made no changes to our pre-measures forecast after the 31st of October. When we closed our pre-measures forecast, and all of the major judgments that we'd made about the outlook for the macroeconomy, both on the downgraded productivity, but also the offsetting effects that had happened, that we had made to inflation and real wages, which offset more than offset the downgraded productivity. Those judgments had been made in the round one forecast. So to that extent, there was no good news about the pre-measures forecast after the 31st of October. Because that forecast had been closed, and also those main judgments, including the offsetting effects of higher inflation and higher real earnings on things like income tax and VAT, those judgments had been made at the start of the process in early September. And it was those bits of briefing in the media, which I should say, were attributed to Treasury sources. One never knows what those sources exactly mean, and they weren't words that came out of the Chancellor's mouth, but they had created a misconception that we had reopened our pre-measures forecast after the 31st of October, and I thought it was very important to correct that misconception.
The Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, is making a speech today about the OBR, in which I understand from what I read in the Financial Times that he's saying the OBR is a very valuable institution and ought to be preserved. But he also poses some questions. A couple of them were quoted in the FT. The first is the economic modelling used by the OBR, sufficiently flexible to fully capture the dynamic of impacts of policy. I think that's probably referring particularly to taxation policy. And then secondly, he says the OBR should be prepared to be more open-minded about innovative approaches, even if there's little evidence that they've been tried before in the UK and shown to work. Are you open-minded about this, and what do you think about the first question about the dynamic effects?
Well, I look forward to catching up with Samel's speech, and he's somebody who's made a lot of fiscal policy in his life, and he's also chaired the Treasury Committee, so he knows a lot about the work of making fiscal policy, but also the work of the OBR in forecasting it. I think the OBR has dynamic models for assessing all of government policy, both on the tax side and on the spending side. As I'm sure we'll get onto later in the session, over the last 3 years, the OBR has taken a much more transparent approach to trying to assess the so-called supply-side effects of policy changes, and show its working in its documentation about how things like reductions in taxes on labour supply can boost boost the labour supply and boost people's contribution to the workforce. How reductions in taxes on business can boost business investment. How changes to the planning rules can boost house construction. So we have tried to be more transparent in the way in which we capture those dynamic effects in our forecast. Previously, they'd always kind of been implicit in our economic and fiscal forecast, but we felt as though both for the sake of transparency and accountability for the judgments we were making, but also for the sake of providing more predictability to policymakers about what kind of dynamic effects we might assume, that it was only fair to provide more detail about how we make those judgments. And I should say we're always open-minded and keen for people to provide us with input, evidence, analysis that can help inform those judgments. We always based any judgments about, be it the effect of tax changes on people's employment choices, the effect of planning reforms on house building, we always drew on what were the best empirical studies out there in the literature. If they existed in the UK, that was great, because they would take account of all the peculiarities of the United Kingdom. If they existed for other countries, we would do our best to transpose them onto UK experience and context. And so we always tried to draw on the best empirical literature we would find. We did think it was important to have some empirical grounding to those judgments, and we are blessed in having lots of really good macro and microeconomists in this country who do lots of work on these kind of areas. One thing which I think the OBR and the government could do more is that where there are areas that it knows it has an advanced and future policy agenda, to actually get some good pieces of analysis to say, well, look, you want to make this change to labour taxation, or you want to make this change to business taxation. What would a good panel regression show you about the impact of that on people's decisions to work or remain at home, or businesses' decisions to invest or not invest, so that when those policies are mature and announced to Parliament, the OBR is in a position to actually take full account of their impact.
Lastly, and very briefly, does the UK have the right fiscal rules given the current economic fiscal circumstances? Was policy tightening at the start of this Parliament, given the background situation, appropriate? In other words, is the fiscal framework too pro-cyclical?
I guess one thing I'd say, fiscal policy was actually loosened at the start of this Parliament, right? The fiscal rules that we now have in place are amongst the loosest that the UK has had in its history, in that sort of balancing the current budget means that the government can borrow based on its current investment plans up to around 2.5% to 3% of GDP every year. And as I said, because it's a rolling target, it only needs to get there in 3 years' time rather than be there at any point in time. So at the moment, it's allowing us to run a deficit of just under 5% of GDP. And most of that is structural, right? The economy looks reasonably close to trend given where inflation and unemployment are. So much of the borrowing that the government is doing right now is structural borrowing. And so I don't see much element of the government being constrained in its ability to support the economy at the moment. If anything, the rules that we have at the moment are providing the government the capacity to run quite a significant structural deficit.
Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up on that. So one of the things, obviously, that this Chancellor has done is change the debt, the measurement of debt, in terms of changing it from targeting net debt to net financial liability. It says, Has that changed the way government approaches borrowing, you think? Are they taking advantage of that, or is behaviour switched as a result of the change of the way we measure debt?
So it's quite a significant change to the fiscal rules that the UK has traditionally had, which have usually, as you said, just focused on net debt, which means that on the basis of that measure, the government could only offset the borrowing that it did against essentially holdings of cash or other countries' debt. But what it couldn't do, what moving to net financial liabilities allows the government to do is to borrow so long as it is investing in a financial asset, in some kind of financial instrument. So that means either the issuing of a loan or the purchasing of equity. It still doesn't allow the government to borrow to invest in fixed assets like schools, hospitals, railways, military equipment. But it does give them that additional flexibility to borrow to invest in financial assets. Based on what we've seen so far, I'd say the government has made relatively limited use of that additional flexibility. Back in the spending review they announced over the summer, looking out over the next 3 or 4 years, the government increased the amount of what's called financial transactions, so loans and equity investments, by around £2 billion per year, which is not a very significant increase in that kind of investment given how much they're doing elsewhere. Kind of why that's happened, I think it's partly that I think the Treasury's made a very sensible idea, which is to corral the investment decisions in a handful of expert institutions, the National Wealth Fund, something called the National Housing Bank, and a few others, which where you have expertise in project assessment, making this kind of portfolio management, making these kind of investment decisions. Some of these institutions are very new, and I think it's just taking a bit of time for those institutions to get going. But I think another reality is that in practice, the government is still constrained on just the gross financing side. The government still has a relatively high gross financing requirement and gross debt issuance of around 8.5% of GDP. It's still got a net cash requirement of over £100 billion most years. And so that just means that even if the government might want to invest in lots of loans and equity investments, it still feels constrained and conscious that there's a limited appetite for going out there and borrowing lots of money on financial markets.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Lord Razzle.
Thank you, Lord Chair. We've had a lot of evidence that the current rules incentivise governments to operate without a significant fiscal buffer. Indeed, some of us, not our evidence, but certainly I suspect that the Chancellor this time had to rather mask what she was doing to increase the headroom in all the run-up discussions in order to avoid pressure from her party, or indeed the Tory party, to reduce taxes, her party to increase expenditure. Do you want to comment on certainly the first and possibly the second of my questions?
I'll comment on the first, which is that, as I said at the outset, the current rules that the UK has are relatively loose by historical standards and by the standards of fiscal rules that other countries in Europe impose on themselves. They do very little to rebuild fiscal resilience at a time when we're now getting on to 3 or 4 years since the last major shock that hit the UK. We're still running a deficit of just under 5% of GDP. So we're sort of at significant fiscal disequilibrium, despite the fact that we've moved on quite a bit in terms of the shocks we face. So I think the rules that we have at the moment, don't require you, as you leave shocks behind, to significantly rebuild resilience. We're running a significant structural deficit. We're still piling up debt several years on from a shock. We aim to get borrowing down to around 2.5% of GDP by the end of the decade. That's a level that the average advanced economy already reached 2 years ago. So other countries have been much faster. I mean, either because they want to, or because their fiscal rules require them to, have been much faster at rebuilding fiscal resilience in the wake of a common set of shocks that all of us have faced in Europe, right? The COVID and then the energy crisis. So I think the rules that we have at the moment, partly because they've been loosened over time, and partly because of their rolling nature, just means that kind of righting the fiscal ship after a shock happens much more slowly at the moment in the UK compared to what other rules might have required had they remained in place, or compared to what other countries are getting on with doing in other jurisdictions. On top of that, I think you have the issue that governments just have recently set themselves very little headroom, against even those relatively loose rules. So it got as low as £6 billion. It was then in the first budget of this government 9.9. It's now gone up to just above 20. That's still a fraction of the average forecast error against the OBR's forecast, and to be honest, which is around £54 billion, and to be honest, against any forecast, any macroeconomic forecast, that is a very small amount of headroom. I think it was interesting when you had Simon French in front of you. He was saying that kind of average contingency margin for a UK PLC would be around 5% of turnover. The OBR's forecast error is about 3% of turnover if you consider that to be £1.5 trillion worth of revenue. So even that would be, even if you had enough headroom to basically provide you enough insurance against the OBR's average forecast error, that would be less than a typical corporate would be setting aside against its own margin for risk. So I do think a combination of having relatively loose rules and then also setting aside relatively small amounts of headroom given the risks of the outlook has been one of the reasons why kind of fiscal outcomes has drifted away from what you've seen in other countries and what kind of previous governments might have targeted.
But would you accept that the way the politics works, irrespective who the government is, that the economic press forecast before a budget or a significant fiscal event that there's going to be headroom of X, and that immediately puts pressure on the Chancellor to fill that gap, either if you're a Tory by cutting taxes or if you're Labour by increasing expenditure? Is that not pressure that comes from the fiscal rules?
I think so, but it's sort of in the nature of having rules that we want them to do that, in that they're the objectives that you've set for themselves, you want to meet them, and chancellors typically do. So I think that's I describe that as a system working rather than not working.
Thank you very much. Lord Blackwell.
Thank you. Richard, the OBR's role is scoring and evaluating government policies once they're in office. But the reality is a lot of decisions about future fiscal policies and indeed the rules are made in the run-up to an election, in manifestos and in election promises. And the pressures of the election are such that parties are inclined to be less honest than they might be about the difficulties they face and paint a more optimistic picture of what they can do. Do you have any thoughts about how in the UK we could encourage more responsible policy making in the run-up to the election, and is that something that the OBR would have any role in?
Yeah, so I think three things happen in the run-up to general elections which have contributed, I think, to the fiscal situation that we find ourselves in. I think first is that as you approach elections, the incumbent party's fiscal plans become increasingly heroic and implausible. And in particular for the post-election period. I think we saw that with the previous Conservative government's plans for departmental spending, which held real per capita spending frozen in cash terms for 5 years as a way of delivering their stated fiscal objectives going into the next Parliament. But they only explained how they were going to deliver those spending plans for one of those 5 years, which was the year ahead. And as it turned out, when we reopened, when we looked again at those spending plans based on more comprehensive disclosure from the Treasury, there were a number of undisclosed risks in there. So I think, as you approach general elections, I think there's extraordinary pressure on government to say increasingly implausible things about the future. As a way of trying to show that they can square the circle between their fiscal objectives and what they're promising the electorate. I think a second challenge is something which is an issue with all parties, both those in government as well as those in opposition looking to be in government, which is that I don't think any when we looked at the last general election, I don't think any political party presented a comprehensive and costed financial plan for government. They tended to be very explicit and very specific about what they weren't going to do or what they weren't going to touch. They avoided being very specific about what they were going to do when they were in government. I think just if you look back at Labour's manifesto, the costed part of the Labour manifesto had them raising and spending around £8 to £9 billion over the course of the government, sort of in the final year of the government of this parliament. If you look at their first budget, they raised £40 billion in tax and they spent 70 billion. So it was nothing like what their actual plan, what their actual fiscal plans turned out to be in government. And so I do think that, when you look at party manifestos in the UK compared to what you see in other countries, are just much less sort of comprehensive, well-costed plans for government, and tend to be just very different from what governments end up doing in practice. And then I think a third issue that we have in the UK is that when governments do get elected, and they codify their fiscal objectives in legislation, in the Charter for Budget Responsibility, there is remarkably little discussion, either in public or in Parliament. There's no parliamentary debate. There's very little analysis that goes into sort of assessing and evaluating and demonstrating the kind of features, risks, and benefits of that particular set of fiscal rules. And I think, as a result, fiscal rules tend to be very tied to the person of the Chancellor, but they seem to have much less buy-in from the governing party, from the rest of Parliament, whereas in other countries, fiscal rules just last longer because there's just much more buy-in to the fact that people think these are the right rules for the country. They should guide fiscal policy making until these objectives are met. And so I do think post-election, it's remarkable how quickly fiscal rules kind of just get adopted and put on statute, and then people then start to criticise them in retrospect and say, well, I wouldn't have gone for those ones if we'd known this or that. And most of those features were well understood at the time. Those rules were presented to Parliament for discussion. I do think some other countries have found ways of addressing these various problems, sometimes using their fiscal councils, but sometimes just using kind of interesting institutional and procedural innovations. The Australians produced this thing called the PFO, which is the Pre-Election Economic and Fiscal Outlook, and it's not produced by their fiscal council, it's produced by the Australian Treasury, but it's put together by the Treasury sort of in concert with the central bank, with the Parliamentary Budget Office, but it's actually signed off by the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury as that person, as his or her best view of where the economy and public finances are going to go, and it's produced after a general election is called. And it's a sort of discipline on the outgoing governing party because they don't want the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury and this group of people to produce a forecast which looks different from what the government's plans look like, because they would rule that those were, they weren't built on credible bases. The Dutch and other countries, including the Australians and others, do rely on their fiscal councils to cost manifestos. That's not a tradition we have in the UK. It's not in the legal framework. And I'm not necessarily saying it's something which the OBR should do, because we have institutions like the IFS and other bodies that do cost manifestos quite well. But I think the main problem is that there tends to not be enough specifics in the manifestos themselves to actually do the costing. But I do think somebody could provide some guidance for kind of what is good practice in writing party manifestos, so that you can actually understand the financial implications of what government's committed to, so that that kind of costing can be done. And maybe that's something that the IFS could do. Maybe it's something the Treasury Committee could promulgate. But making party manifestos something that the electorate has a better understanding of what they're actually voting for, I think would be good. I think on fiscal rules side, I do think there should be more public debate and parliamentary discussion about fiscal rules before they get adopted. And I do think that better analysis of the features that they have, how they assess how they're consistent with being resilient to the known risks around the forecast, and how they're consistent with medium-term fiscal sustainability, will just lead to a better and more collective sort of parliamentary and national decision to commit themselves to these rules before they're then implemented.
I mean, can I just see if I can crystallise a couple of possible recommendations out then? I mean, the Australian example is interesting. Clearly, one wants, we would want to avoid either the Treasury or the OBR becoming party political in terms of, costing manifestos and being accused of being one-sided or the other. But could you see a case for, say, the OBR producing a pre-election view of the fiscal challenges that was not costing what any party was going to do, but simply setting out his view of what the economy faces over the coming years, against which the parties could then be challenged to address how they would deal with that?
Yeah, so it's a role played obviously by the Australian Treasury in Australia. It's a role in the Netherlands played by something called the Committee on the Budget Margin, which I suspect is an odd translation into English from the Dutch, but it's basically a report produced by a consortium of the head of the Dutch version of the OBR, the Treasury, the Central Bank and others, and they produce precisely that report, which is what are the risks and challenges that are going to face the government in the next parliamentary period, and they actually provide explicit advice about how much headroom the government should have against its fiscal rules in light of those risks. So I think it's a way of trying to build in some contingency into fiscal plans to take account of those risks. So I think other countries have managed to find institutional solutions to both informing the election debate, but also bringing greater realism into fiscal plans once governments are formed, rules are set, and decisions are made. I think they've managed to do it without particularly politicizing any of the organizations. I don't think anyone would accuse the Dutch version of the OBR as being a political institution. And the Australian PBO similarly does work at least on costing of policies without being seen to be drawn into party politics. As I said, I'm not saying particularly the OBR needs to do the costing of manifestos, but I think what's needed more is that there's better guidelines from somewhere about how to make sure a manifesto is actually informative from the point of view of economic and fiscal policy making.
And then secondly, your point about debate around fiscal rules, which at the moment a Chancellor simply announces them and they keep changing, as you've commented. So could you imagine a situation where, and maybe the Bank of England ought to be part of this, Bank of England, the OBR, the Treasury, set out some possibilities and that there is a period of discussion before they're adopted?
I guess the most important thing is that when rules are adopted, there's an exploration and an understanding and a discussion about how they're consistent with actually restoring fiscal sustainability, which is what most governments want to achieve. And I think also that either the design of the rules themselves or in the amount of margin set aside against them, that margin is consistent with what are the known risks around the forecast, which are both the inherent risks in any forecasting process, which, as I said, for the OBR on average 4 years out is over 50 billion, but also just known risks and pressures that everyone knows at the moment are unfunded, be they things that come from the geopolitical sphere, be they just volatility of interest rates and market conditions, be they just the ordinary economic cycle. I think kind of stress testing rules before everybody commits to them and demonstrating their kind of features and risks, I think is something which we could do a better job at before we just kind of go snap and say, right, these are now our permanent fiscal rules which we're going to stick with for a parliament.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Burns.
Thank you. Richard, you mentioned that the OBR does the long-term exercise, and we agree that it's been very welcome innovation. It's provided some very valuable analysis, but could more be done to encourage governments to actively manage fiscal risks and safeguard fiscal resilience over a longer period? You say there could be a better response from government to your reports, but is there anything in the present architecture that means that these long-term pressures receive so little attention? Some of the numbers that you have produced for the longer term, to say they're scary is to minimize them. And in a sense, there's a general view, this cannot happen. Something else is going to have to intervene. And are there any changes in the way in which this is all conducted that could mean more discussion about the longer term public expenditure issues and tax reform? I'm staggered by the extent to which the work that you do in this area really does receive little attention. It's not just that it doesn't receive press attention, but it doesn't seem to inform debate within government.
I think one of the main reasons is that there is not an expectation that the government produces a comprehensive response to the OBR's fiscal risk and sustainability report. As I mentioned, it's gone from being 136 pages to 19. And I think if you want to know what the government's response is, there has to be an expectation on government to produce a response that I think is more comprehensive in terms of explaining how its overall fiscal strategy is consistent with meeting its fiscal rules over the medium term, given the risks that the OBR has identified, and then maintaining fiscal sustainability in the long term, given what we know of the pressures on the public finances. I think it also needs to engage more in the specific risks that the OBR identifies in its reports. Now, obviously, there are lots of them. The OBR produces, in addition to the report which highlights a handful, a kind of encyclopedia of other fiscal risks, be they risk to the expenditure side, the tax side, which add up to sort of 50 odd. You wouldn't expect the government to have a detailed response to every single one of those. But I do think government could say more about what is seen to be the most material risks to the outlook at the moment. I do think, as I said, I think it's good that that report gets the attention of this committee and the Treasury Committee of the Commons. But it is notable that there is no parliamentary debate about the FRS and no expectation that any minister has to kind of, other than present this written ministerial statement, which lately just gets published alongside the EFO and everything else. That there's not focus on the floor of the House or in other places on these issues.
If you put yourself in the position of the Chancellor, can you reflect on why they might have frustrations with the existing dialogue that takes place? I mean, we keep hearing, in a sense, suggestions from various quarters about this. Are there any changes in the whole rules and the way in which these exercises are conducted that would make the Chancellor's job easier and make them feel more in touch with, in a sense, the analysis of what is going on?
Do you mean around our forecast or FRSs or otherwise?
Well, about the budget process. I'm thinking of the whole budget process, where there is, I sense some frustration that it's a bit like playing postal chess, that there is a long delay between what you say and then their response and then what you say, and some of that could possibly be leading to some frustration. I'm just wondering, what is there in the architecture that we're looking at that would make the Chancellor's job easier?
I guess during my time, I guess partly because I was forecasting in the midst of a pandemic and then an energy crisis. I mean, I was oftentimes the bearer of bad news to chancellors and to the Treasury, and so to some extent it's sort of understandable that they're not thrilled to hear that there's this latest shock to the economy and public finances. It has these consequences. It's going to require a difficult set of decisions. These things are oftentimes disrupting what are ultimately the plans, which their policy plans for which they feel they got elected and want to implement, and then they're suddenly told this bit of bad news, which is going to make that more difficult. So, I think to some extent, they didn't always look forward to meetings with the OBR for those reasons. But we did meet regularly with this Chancellor, with her predecessors as well, to talk through our forecasts. Those discussions were always respectful, professional. They got increasingly focused on substance over time as well, I would say, which was, I think, a good thing. Talking about changes to our forecast, talking about how we were going to treat measures. I think one thing that we endeavoured to do on the OBR side was just always try and be predictable in the judgments that we made. And then when we're making big judgments, like the change we made to productivity in this most recent forecast, to make them as early as we can, so that we could signal to policymakers that they may well require an adjustment to policy, and thinking about the consequences of those changes. So we try to operate a kind of no surprises policy in the way we arrive at our own judgments. The reality is the world offers plenty of surprises these days anyway, including to policies being made in other jurisdictions, which you just have to sort of reflect on and plug into forecasts. So I think from the OBR side, trying to be as predictable as possible in the judgments that it makes, which I think means about being as transparent as you can about how we put forecasts together. I think on the Treasury side, it just means kind of just accepting there is a lot of volatility out there in the world, and that gets reflected in a volatile forecast. And to try and basically to try and give yourselves enough headroom to absorb that kind of volatility, but also be nimble enough in policy making that if it turns out that the amount of the shock that we've seen in the most recent forecast exceeds that headroom, to be able to make policy changes to keep you on track on meeting your fiscal targets.
Lord Lonsborough.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Many commentators describe the OBR as policing government policy rather than simply being a forecaster and assessor of fiscal policies. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I'm sure you're familiar with them. Well, last week, Julian Jessup, the economist, described the OBR as the economic equivalent of football's VAR, overly fussy and constantly second-guessing government decisions. Andy Haldane described the OBR as, quote, inhibitor, not enabler of growth. And David Susskind, in a similar vein, described the OBR as the ultimate arbiter on the government's plan to achieve economic growth. In other words, judge and jury. What do you make of these assessments?
Well, I don't agree with them.
And why is that?
So the only powers that the OBR has are those that are given to it by Act of Parliament. These are powers delegated, by vote of people in this House, which were to produce a forecast and analyse the risks around it, to assess whether the government's on track to meet its fiscal rules, and to cost government policies. And those are the three things which the OBR has done throughout my predecessor's tenure, throughout my tenure. Unlike the majority of the 50-odd fiscal councils out there in the world, we're actually explicitly prohibited from giving the government policy advice or feeding our ideas into the policy-making machine, either publicly or privately. And one of the things which we have consistently done, and including in our private interactions with the Chancellor and Treasury, is to always stop ourselves from advising on policy, because that is not our role. It's for the Treasuries and policymakers to make. When it comes down to kind of, are we somehow, nonetheless, are we somehow having an influence on the policy-making process? Well, look, Chancellors set their own fiscal rules. If they want to break them, they can break them. If they want to change them, they can change them. And as we've discussed, they frequently do, once every 1.8 years since 2010. So, Chancellors constrain themselves to their own rules, but oftentimes change rules. Governments often change rules when they don't suit them. I think, as you've also discussed in this committee, in principle, the Chancellor is not obliged to use our forecast if they don't want to. They can disagree with aspects of them, but none have opted to do without an OBR forecast, with one exception, and that had the consequences that it did. And just more fundamentally, in a given budget, we're costing, a few tens of billions of pounds worth of policy measures one way or the other. At any point in time, every Chancellor is in charge of £1.5 trillion worth of revenue, £1.5 trillion worth of spending. That gives them £3 trillion worth of choices in which to make those decisions. I think what creates the impression that the OBR's forecasts are somehow driving policy has been this fact that Chancellors have left themselves very tiny amounts of headroom against fiscal rules to which they are very personally committed. And so the net result is that the normal amount of volatility in any macroeconomy, from over any 6-month period, gets translated into a normal amount of volatility in terms of changes to the forecast, which can't be absorbed by the tiny buffers which Chancellors have left themselves in recent years, and that results in significant volatility in policy making. What's driving that relationship between the forecast and policy making is the very small amount of headroom the Chancellors have left themselves. There wasn't this relationship. Back when George Osborne had £80 billion worth of headroom against his fiscal rules, or Philip Hammond had 40 billion, you didn't see that kind of one-to-one relationship between changes in forecasts and changes in policy. It really is an artifact of leaving very, very small margins against rules to which Chancellors feel very personally committed to meeting, and them operating in an inherently volatile environment.
And this issue of very narrow headroom and a very tight fiscal tightrope, certainly, does it not, it raises the profile and the influence of the OBR because of the sensitivity. As you say, if it was an 80 billion buffer, then there'd be far less media and political interest in the assessments and the forecasts of the OBR. And has the OBR not found itself partly in this corner because the margin for error is so tight that you're a bit of a convenient punch bag? I mean, the organisation is.
I think so. I think it's a bit like blaming the Met Office for changes in kind of national fashion trends. People say, "Oh, look, the Met Office is forecasting it's going to be cold and everyone suddenly puts their coats on. It's like people aren't putting their coats on because of the Met Office forecast. They're putting their coats on because it was cold yesterday and it's likely to be cold tomorrow. It's a kind of reasonable response to the environment that you're in. The OBR is just communicating that in a technical way, through its models and forecasts to policymakers. Fiscal policy in this country is constrained because we've got debt approaching 100% of GDP and a deficit of 5% of GDP. It's not because of the OBR's forecast. The OBR's forecast shows it coming down. The reason we're constrained is because we've got a lot of debt and we're borrowing more than almost any other advanced economy at the moment.
Thank you. Lord Davis.
Yes, I want to ask about the...
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry, Lord, I forgot. My apologies. Lord Liddell had a brief follow-up and I forgot. I'm so sorry.
Follow-up. You said you're by statute not allowed to propose policy. Shouldn't we be thinking about whether that's right? It seemed to me a possible institutional model. I mean, the Conservatives tried, and I was very in favour of it, setting up this Economic Strategy Council with Andy Haldane to come up with bold ideas for how we promote growth in this country, for which there's a wide political consensus that is the top priority of the government. I mean, wouldn't it be right for the OBR to actually tell the government, look, if you're serious about promoting growth, what you should be doing is this and this and this, because that is what our models tell us.
So I think Parliament in its wisdom has prohibited us from doing so.
Yeah.
I do think it was a good decision and a prescient one, in that I've seen and worked with fiscal councils in other countries where they provide precisely that function, which is providing policy advice for government, to government about what to do about the fiscal situation. And I think what tends to happen is they just become another voice in the cacophony of voices feeding into fiscal policy. And I think in the UK we are already blessed with a number of very good institutions which come up with policy ideas, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, NISA, the Resolution Foundation, the CPS. They've all got good policy ideas which feed into the policy-making process. I suspect if you asked people in the OBR what their ideas would be, they would sound an awful lot like what you hear from those institutions depending on the topic. And so I don't think people who work in the OBR are particularly privileged in knowing what to do about what the right policy solution to a given societal problem is. I think they also have no legitimacy in providing that kind of advice because they're not elected, and they don't work closely with ministers. I think what they're good at and have proven themselves good at is kind of forecasting the economy and actually costing the ultimate policy decisions of government. I don't think if in the end the OBR started providing policy advice, it would add very much to the policy debate, which is already enriched by these other institutions.
Apologies, Lord Davis, over to you.
I wanted to ask about the Budget Responsibility Committee and whether it's right that it should be 3 members. I know this is an issue that I understand this is an issue you've thought about, but before directly answering the question, could you just give some idea about how the committee actually works in practical terms? Are there other people present who make substantive contributions as well as those who have the final vote?
Yeah. So I guess one thing to remember about the OBR by comparison with other sort of independent bodies in the macroeconomic policy-making space is that the OBR is a forecaster, not a policymaker. And I think, and one of the most important things to remember about the OBR is that it needs to produce a consensus forecast. So the BRC is comprised of 3 members: the chair, the economic expert, and the fiscal expert, and they've all got to agree on every single number in the forecast. Because if you think about it, the alternative would be that you had three different forecasts from 3 different members of the BRC. The government would almost certainly choose the most optimistic one and say we're going to base our fiscal plans on that because we really like that person's view of things. The opposition would almost certainly choose the most pessimistic one and say that this shows how the country is going to the dogs under this government's fiscal plans. And I do think it's actually in the process of discussion and deliberation within the BRC, and which I should say are always informed by expert advice from our excellent staff about kind of where we think things should go. And obviously, when I was there, David's voice had a lot of weight on the economic forecast side because he's a much more experienced macroeconomist than I am. Tom always had more weight on the fiscal side because he was much closer to the fiscal details. But all the decisions we made collectively. Every number in the forecast we stood behind as a group of people. And so I do think if you were to expand the number of people on the Budget Responsibility Committee and try to make it more like the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, where you had kind of 9 different perspectives and 9 different voices, well, none of those 9 people have to sign up to the bank's forecast. It's kind of a staff forecast, but they've all got their own individual views about where they think the economy is going and how interest rates have to respond. And what they do have to do is make a decision about one thing, which is interest rates. Whereas the OBR has to operate by consensus. It's got to form that view amongst a number of people around which you can get a consensus, and it's got to have enough time and enough input to arrive in that. I do think if you expanded the number of people on the committee significantly, inevitably what you would get is, because it has to produce a consensus forecast, you just empower the most outlandish view, because they would have a de facto veto on the consensus. And so you would end up pulling the forecast to one or other extreme, depending on who wanted to hold out until they got the particular view of where they thought the economy or the public finances or a particular costing were going. So I think you have to keep the BRC down to a manageable number of people so that you can all get behind a consensus forecast as informed by the analysis that staff do. And I should say we don't do that at all in isolation. We have an advisory panel of 25 macroeconomic and microeconomic experts, including city forecasters, academics, people who work in think tanks, people who work in business. We regularly consult experts on topics which we are not au fait with. When we had a big energy crisis, we just rung up people who knew about energy markets and how they operated and said, come in and talk to us about where Britain gets its gas from, how much it costs, how it feeds into both the commercial and retail price of gas, how do we feed it into our inflation forecast. So we regularly try and engage experts in the outside world in kind of those deliberations and those discussions. So it's not at all a kind of closed ivory tower where we just talk to ourselves. But I do think you have to keep the numbers of people on the committee to a manageable number, with also a reasonable tenure, such that if you're constantly changing the composition of the committee, you're going to have a very volatile forecast, because every newcomer is going to have a slightly different take on how things are going. Or you run the risk of, if you're bringing new people on all the time, well, they're not up to speed on what was in the last forecast. They'll take a few forecasts to figure out quite where things are going, and then by the time they've figured it out, they're moving on and making space for the next person to rotate on.
So remind us of the rules on length of membership.
So 5-year terms, nominated by the Chancellor, approved by the Treasury Committee, and then renewable for a period of for another period of 5 years, so a maximum of 10 years. I mean, I should say, now that I've departed, the whole of the BRC will have turned over the last 5 years. None of the members who were running the OBR in 2020 are still there.
Thank you very much. Lord Puttigan.
Yes. My question is about the characterization of the relation between the OBR and the Treasury and the government. And I'm not suggesting we go over your statement again, but more harking back to the 5-year tenure. During that time, how would you characterize that relationship? Clearly, the level of transparency and good relationship is paramount to the underpinning of the quality of the information you get in order to build the forecasts. Certainly, we got from the staff of the OBR in some of our inquiry very positive feedback. The general consensus, things went well. Having said that, there were 2 obviously mishaps that were pretty well advertised. One was the Hunt sort of debate about the 22 billion black hole, and of course the timing of the productivity change or update. And so maybe those 2 were perhaps some dissonance compared to what we've heard. So generally speaking, in the last 5 years, what's your characterization, and are there lessons learned from all this and things you would suggest should be changed?
So I think, setting aside, I mean, for me, the biggest exception was the period leading up to the mini budget in the autumn of 2022, where basically there was no relationship between the Treasury and the OBR at the time, but it then very quickly got re-established in the aftermath of the mini budget. I mean, setting that period to one side, during my 5 years running the OBR, our relationship with the government has been characterised by professionalism, sort of mutual trust, a high degree of necessary collaboration in putting together the forecast, because the OBR has 52 staff, the Treasury has 2,000. There are also thousands of other people occupied in other parts of government which are helping us to put together our forecasts. So we rely, we make all the judgments ourselves, and ultimately everything that goes into the economic and fiscal outlook is the OBR's content. But we draw on information, expertise from all around government. The discussion, the decisions and judgments that we make about things like productivity are decisions which we make, in discussion with the Treasury. When we were conducting our supply side review over the summer, that was a process which included a series of exchanges with Treasury economists. The Treasury has a lot of excellent macroeconomists who shared their analysis of where they thought the trajectory of the UK economy was headed. We also talked to lots of other experts in the city and in academia about what they thought, and then came to our own view in light of what we'd heard. So I think we collaborate very well with the experts in those sorts of areas. I think from time to time, bits of the fiscal framework come under stress, and I think reveal weaknesses in the fiscal framework which need to be addressed. I think the issues around the planning and forecasting of public spending that came to light in the run-up to and the aftermath of the last general election was a good example of that. I mean, the forecasting of public spending and spending on public services was always kind of a lacuna of the UK's fiscal framework, because it's more straightforward to forecast tax and benefits because policy is clear. If you leave it unchanged, you just run tax policy through how many hours are being worked, and you figure out what that means for income taxes over the next 5 years. There are many fewer parameters to go on when you're trying to look at the health service, defence spending, asylum, policing, because ultimately those are complicated machines delivering public services to people, and governments can try and tell you those machines are getting more efficient. They can try and tell you they've got plans to bring spending down. But what was revealed in the run-up to the last election was that the Treasury was aware of risks and pressures on those budgets, which they should have disclosed to us at the time we were doing our March forecast, and they didn't. But what I would say about the Treasury is that we did a review of that episode. The Treasury committed to a much more transparent approach to the planning and forecasting of departmental spending, and I think we did move to a much better system for doing that, which has more bottom-up element on the OBR side, and where the OBR asks a lot more searching questions, and also has the outright discretion to disagree with the Treasury's view of public services spending, as it did in its last forecast. And so I think where weaknesses in the framework get revealed, I do think the OBR and the Treasury are quite good at getting back together and figuring out how to close them. The same was true about how to close the gap revealed by the mini budget, which was the ability of governments to basically announce major fiscal policy decisions without an accompanying OBR forecast. The introduction of the fiscal lock, I think, was a very good innovation, which closed what was a very apparent and costly gap in the way in which we run the public finances. So I think in that sense, from time to time, the system comes under stress and reveals a set of weaknesses. But more or less, in the fullness of time, we've been pretty good at closing those gaps.
Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to follow up?
Just a quick follow-up. You mentioned the 52 staff, which I just wanted to quickly come back to your opening comments in relation to the fact that human beings make mistakes. There are only 52 staff, a budget of £6 million. Is there not an issue around the resourcing of the OBR? You're saying from time to time it comes under particular levels of stress, but it seems to me a low level of a resourcing for an organisation that we've already discussed has a very high profile.
I think the OBR is the right size for the job that it's got at the moment. And I should say it's grown quite a bit since it was first established. It started out with around 17, so it's significantly larger than it used to be. It's much smaller than the CBO has in the US or the Dutch version of the OBR, the Central Planning Bureau, which has got several hundred. But I do think, because the way in which we prepare our forecast, which is drawing on analysis and expertise from across governments, but coming to our own judgments, I think works. And where we've taken on new responsibilities, be they to produce the fiscal risk and stability report, to do this, to be more transparent about the way we score supply side effects. One thing I would say about the Treasury is that the Treasury holds the purse strings on the OBR, right? It decides how much funding the OBR gets over a given 3-year period. at no point when the OBR has been given new responsibilities in legislation has the Treasury not provided the resources that go along with that. So I do think the OBR is reasonably well resourced for the job that it's given. I think the Treasury has been good about resourcing the OBR where it gives it new responsibilities to undertake. I would worry about it getting too big and too unwieldy in the sense that it would make it more difficult to arrive at those kind of consensuses and to have a good understanding of what every person in the organisation is doing at any point in time within the management structure. But I think we try and do things as cheaply as possible, because when you're called the Office of Budget Responsibility, you want to make sure that you manage your budget responsibly, even when it's only £6 million.
Thank you, Lord Turnbull.
In an earlier answer, you said people are getting a better understanding of the work of the OBR. Well, I'd say maybe, but I still don't think that we're where we really want to be. And so there are still questions to look at, how it reports and how those reports are analysed and debated. There are some clear improvements. The expanding of the fiscal margin, I think, is definitely an improvement. There's also I think, a question not yet achieved, but that we should be working towards a world in which the FRS, if that's the right word, the FRS gets more prominence relative to the economic outlook, and that can be worked upon. Now, all this has got to come into, however, another change we haven't yet talked about, which is the 1-2. The 1-2 is one fiscal event and two forecasts. How is that going to work? And is it actually workable? One situation which I'm worried about is there is a budget and an outlook, and the two kind of cohere, and some fiscal prospects are laid out. Some months later, and we haven't decided how many months that should be, some months later it becomes apparent that we're not really on that trajectory. But this time, the Chancellor is going to say, I'm not going to respond to that, as I've often done in the past. I'm actually going to wait until the next report. Now that requires a kind of a patience and a maturity from all sorts of people, media, politicians, markets and so on, to wait and see. Now, so we get away from, if we can achieve it, we would get away from sort of knee-jerk responses to some very small changes in very small margins. But are we going to achieve that? Or do you think that once anything is produced which shows it's not going in the right direction, the pressure for immediate response will be overwhelming?
Well, I think it's easier to achieve if you've got more headroom against your fiscal rules, and in the spring forecast you're less likely to be at risk of missing them. So I think more headroom just gives government more space, more time and space to deliberate about policy without facing those kind of immediate pressures about what you're going to do, about the fact that your rules are either on track to be missed or close to being missed. So I think having a bigger margin against any rule you set for yourself has to be part of the answer. I think also, it must be possible because nearly every other country in the world does it this way, which is that like every other advanced economy produces at least 2 economic and fiscal forecasts a year. Almost every other advanced economy just has 1 budget a year, usually in the autumn. And they treat the spring forecast as a kind of a mixture of a sort of update, kind of health check on the economy and public finances on the way to a set of decisions in the autumn, and a sort of firing of the starting pistol on a kind of longer preparation of the budget between spring and the autumn. I mean, I'd say at the moment, one challenge we have in this country at the moment is that there's quite a short gap between the autumn forecast and the spring forecast, which means you're then going to have a very long gap between a spring forecast at the beginning of March and then a budget whenever it's going to happen in the autumn. Most other countries spread it out so that it's more like 6 months and 6 months, but that's those timings can move around. I do think thinking about the spring forecast is something which provides the context and framework for thinking about fiscal policy making, over the course of the summer into the autumn. It provides government to do something which I think it does less and less of for reasons I don't fully understand, but just consultation on policy options and choices, as opposed to just making policy decisions very rapidly with relatively little consultation in fiscal events. Now, part of that was driven by shocks, but if you have a period of relative peace in the economy and in the fiscal outlook, that gives you more time to consult on options, think about them, and then actually implement them and announce them, the final details in the budget. So I think using the spring forecast as a thing that sets the framework and context for a discussion and dialogue with Parliament and with the public about policy options for addressing whatever fiscal challenges get revealed in the spring, I think it is the way that the budget process works in other countries, and I don't see any reason why it couldn't work that way here.
Is there a need before this next spring forecast for someone to say something about how it is intended that this system operates? In other words, don't expect me to simply respond as people have done in the recent past. If you wait until you get there, and people still won't have an understanding of why you're changing it in this way and what are the benefits that you can extract from it, which you've just set out.
I think it would be helpful. I think it's always helpful when governments just explain how processes are going to work, because lots of stakeholders have stakes in the outcomes. I mean, the OBR has been clear that in the spring, it will continue to produce forecasts for the current balance and for net financial liabilities. So you will be able to see the trajectory of those things. What the government has said is that it won't treat the spring forecast as a formal assessment of those rules, and so it won't feel obliged to respond with policy to any changes in those forecasts. And that is the way fiscal policy making works in most other countries, which is they consider that thing to be a sort of interim check, and then they reconcile things in the autumn and bring things into line with their fiscal targets in the autumn. And if the spring forecast reveals a bit of breathing space, they have a think about how they might use it up. If the spring forecast reveals a deficit against where they want to be, then they've got a process between the spring and the autumn in thinking about how to fill that gap with policy. And so, I do think clarity about how that process will work will just help make it more predictable. And in my experience, the more predictable processes are, the better they tend to run, and the more satisfied people are with the outcomes.
Thank you. Baroness Wolf.
Yes, my question relates to the OBR's recent experiences with dynamic scoring of supply-side effects of fiscal policy. And indeed, it's a return in a way to the discussion that you had with Lord Liddell about the OBR's role in recommending or affecting policy. And I totally accept that your job is not to propose policies, but I'd like your view on how important the scoring is and whether it's appropriately important in determining the policies that governments actually adopt. And I'm not sure that I don't think there's anything you can avoid, but I'd be very interested in your views on this, because for example, when we had Robert Choate and Andy King here, they talked about the fact that the process of scoring can make for quite a difficult OBR-Treasury relationship, because clearly the Treasury wants you to score stuff and say it'll have a wonderful effect, and you might disagree. And you referred to the fact that you tried to be as transparent as possible and look at the evidence, but of course academic and statistical and recent history is always going to be partial, and there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. And this also has a knock-on effect, not just in direct relationships with the Treasury, but with what the Treasury basically encourages ministers to propose and not to propose. And as I said, I don't have any solution for this, but I would be very interested in your comments on the experiences and the fact that, for example, you've upped the bar and lowered the bar, and whether there are any conclusions you have about going forward, whether maybe there's too much transparency, or whether one should just make the bar very high, or any general conclusions about this?
Yeah. So I should start out by saying that the OBR was always very transparent about how it, we're talking about assessing the economic effects of policy measures.
Yes. So
usually fiscal policy measures, but sometimes also regulatory policies and other kind of changes. The OBR was always very transparent about how it calculated the demand side effects of fiscal policy. It used a set of fiscal multipliers. They were around since Lord Burns was in the Treasury. They're pretty standard. They're re-estimated from time to time. But they take the package as a whole and then apply it to aggregate demand. The effects are always temporary because ultimately you can't stimulate demand forever. At some point you start pushing up inflation. There's an interest rate response, and that brings demand back into line with supply. I think what we're talking about here on dynamic scoring is what we decided to do back in 2022 was to be much more transparent about the economic effects of policies on the supply side of the economy, where we made a decision early on, that we couldn't do it for everything, and that we had to be selective, but that it was important to be more transparent for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that it was always implicit in our forecast. It was sometimes coming as a surprise to the Chancellor when we would say that particular tax change is having this effect on labour supply, which may or may not offset what you think you're doing. And that we needed to be more transparent about that. We'd also made a very big judgment about the supply side of one very big economic policy decision, which was that to leave the European Union, which we estimated was going to reduce potential output by 4% in 15 years. We were very transparent about how we made that judgment, but it raised a legitimate question about, well, what about other things which might affect the supply side of the economy in a negative or positive way in future? So we sort of, we decided to embark on this approach of being more transparent about supply side effects. It was also designed to just, respond to criticism that, we can't be supply side nihilists as forecasters. If governments want to produce pro-growth policies, they have a right to understand what might be the growth impact of the policies that they were pursuing. But we did, set 4 criteria. They had to be significant, additional, they had to be durable, and they had to be evidence-based. And that was a way of trying to filter out, what could potentially be hundreds and hundreds of policies where we had to think about the supply side effects of those. It's been highly instructive to look at what's happened since then and the policies that we have been presented with by the Treasury and which we have reflected in the supply side of our forecast. We had 19 over the course of 5 fiscal events. And I think what we've learned about them in the process, the most striking thing is basically just how small the growth impacts of most of these policy changes have been. The average effect of those 19 policies was to change potential output by 0.04 on the level in 5 years' time. So an even smaller amount on the growth rate over those 5 years. So generally speaking, a lot of what government was announcing as growth initiatives were too small to actually be able to know, to change the roundings on any of the OBR's GDP figures in 5 years' time. But you got the biggest positive impact from, basically a set of tax changes, the changes to NICs, both up and down, from the reforms to planning, from the big increase in public investment that the government announced in its first budget. And those were, more material. They're on the order of kind of 0.2 to 0.25% on the level of potential output in 5 years' time. And so it was very clear that there was a large number of very small measures which were not really making that material difference to our economic forecast, and a small number of quite significant measures which probably were slightly moving the dial on potential output in 5 years' time. I think what had concerned us was that in setting up this framework, quite quickly, it spawned a cottage industry across government of just trying to come up with anything you can to try and move the supply side of the OBR's forecast, because in principle it's sort of free money if you can get it in the forecast. And so we did feel the need, both to spare kind of the analysts in the department themselves, as well as the pressures being put on the OBR as a forecaster, to say, look, we really are just going to focus on, we're going to define significant much more clearly to mean 0.1% in 5 years' time on the level of potential output. Anything which we think is below that, basically, we'll assume that their effects are broadly symmetric and offsetting in our forecast, and we're not going to take account of them. And what was interesting is that as a result of that, in this most recent forecast, there were no growth measures that we scored on the supply side, positive or negative. Not even the tax changes, not even the further increase in the further freezing of NICS thresholds and income tax thresholds for further years into the forecast. So I think in that sense, I think it's refocused the framework on where it should be, which is where the government's making significant and durable changes to the supply side of the economy. As forecasters, we take account of those because that's important, having a good forecast. But we're not at all interested in being the arbiters of government growth policy and somehow saying that's a good growth policy and it goes in our forecast, or that's a bad growth policy and government shouldn't go ahead with it. We don't want to be in that position, and we set the threshold to make sure that we're focused on the policies that enable us capturing the effects of policies that enable us to get our forecast right, rather than whether the policy itself is good or bad. That's not a judgment for the OBR to make.
Do you think that the Treasury and government has understood how tiny the effects normally are, and that the cottage industry might be, if not exterminated, at least in fairly clear retreat?
I think so, because they were disappointed by the results, right? I mean, I think they tended to be crestfallen to discover that kind of all the work that they put in came up with relatively small changes to the level of output in 5 years' time. Now, one of the things which the changed framework still allows for is the government to kind of package together policies. And I think the thing which the OBR will need to police going forward is how do you stop the government putting together kind of happy meals of policies, which is, kind of hamburgers, some French fries, and a kind of apple pie all going together, and we'll call that, a growth strategy, and how about that? That's not really what you want to see in the future. That threshold needs to be applied to individual policies and their impact on the forecast.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you think? Oh, I'm sorry. No, Lord Blackwell first, please. Yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering whether this econometric approach, as you like, to evaluating policy options does have the potential to underscore more radical policy changes that might be proposed. So let me just explain what the modelling approach is effectively a bottom-up view of the economy, that there are millions of individuals whose actions contribute, and if you can model those accurately enough, it sort of determines what the next phase of the economy is going to be, and you can just technocratically, as it were, project that forward. There's another view of the economy that says a few big decisions by a few people actually shape the economy and the way people react. Entrepreneurs who created Microsoft or an Amazon, or change the way people think about investment. And those are top-down, big shifts, not things that you come out of modelling the details in the econometric model. And if you had a government that, as opposed to a cottage industry of small things, was proposing some fundamentally big shifts in the framework for the economy, how would you be able to accommodate those?
Yeah. So the OBR is comprised of technicians, who are tasked with trying to think about how to forecast things. And I think it is a good discipline on governments to try and produce evidence for their assertions about the transformative effects of their policies. And I do think there would be nothing wrong with a government that said, we think this policy can have a transformative effect, and here is the evidence, to support that assertion, rather than just assert it. I think we've always shied away from sort of faith-based forecasting in the OBR about sort of, do you believe in a particular sort of direction or agenda? It's always about what can you actually demonstrate has made a difference in the past. And then if it's an entirely novel policy, we'll point to some analogy or some mechanism through economic modelling, which shows how it would manifest itself either in this country or in another place. So I think we've always had an open mind. I think there's, we would definitely encourage more work on what kind of policies have the right kind of growth effects. I think where governments, are kind of going for a moonshot and saying, well, look, we're going to try this thing out, it just might work. It could well completely transform sort of entrepreneurialism and the investment climate in this country, and we expect that to happen. Well, as a forecaster looking around, if that's the case, well, when that government, announces the policy, you ought to see that reflected in business investment intentions, equity prices, and so in that sense, you ought to pick it up in your forecast anyway, because business sentiment is rising, investment intentions are going up, and so you ought to capture those kind of sentiment impacts in your baseline forecast. If it's a delayed effect, well, if it really is transformative, well, then you'll probably pick it up in the next forecast in any case. So, just be patient, and maybe that's a reason to announce it in the spring and then implement it in the autumn, when the transformative effect it's having on national sentiment is manifesting itself. But the OBR, tends to rely on evidence for the effects of policies, and then, it definitely doesn't try and second guess the sentiment of the business people, entrepreneurs, and the economy. It draws those from the best indicators we can get of, kind of business sentiment and others. So yeah.
Thank you. Lord Vergy, over to you.
Thank you for your contribution today, Mr. Hughes. It seems we've lost a very good contributor to UK economic policy. My question today is, obviously we've covered this in your whole evidence session, but could you give us 2 or 3 really important recommendations you would like to see in our report, and key issues that you would like to see us emphasize in our report?
I think the most important thing I could say is that I do think this committee is asking the right questions, and that its inquiries that it's had in this session and all the previous ones, which I've watched, I think you're exploring the right avenues, which are around how can we make our fiscal rules more binding on fiscal outcomes, because clearly the UK is increasingly fiscally vulnerable and an outlier compared to all other advanced economies. We've got the 6th highest debt, the 5th highest deficit, and the 2nd highest borrowing costs amongst 35 advanced economies. That's not a good fiscal place to be. And so our fiscal framework needs to deliver more binding and more sustainable fiscal outcomes, and thinking about how you can do that through the design of rules, and also finding ways of building in institutionally better amounts, higher amounts of headroom against those rules, which is commensurate with the risks to the forecast, I think is also a second thing which is really worth thinking hard about in the UK context. And as I said, other countries seem to have come up with institutional solutions to dealing with those things. And then finally, I think this committee's focus on how to bring more prominence and public and government attention to the management of fiscal risks and the maintenance of fiscal sustainability by getting a stronger sort of government and policy response and a richer discussion in Parliament and in the wider country about these issues, I think is really important. I would encourage you down all those lines, but I wouldn't be so bold as to offer specific solutions. I think the only other thing I would say is that I think the importance of avoiding any councils of despair and thinking that somehow these problems are insoluble. All of our fiscal problems are man-made, and men and women need to be their solution. And so I do think that this country in the past and a host of other advanced economies have actually managed to get themselves out of fiscal difficulty and get themselves into more sustainable fiscal positions, some of which were in much worse positions than we were a few years ago, if you look at countries in Southern Europe. So it's clearly possible to tighten up fiscal frameworks, deliver more responsible policies, and get better fiscal outcomes. And I'm really pleased that this committee is focused on these kind of questions, because I think they are of increasing urgency.
A couple of quick follow-ups. Lord Lamont and then Lord Razzle.
Oh, you've given us brilliant evidence, I think, this afternoon. I'm afraid I was just a little bit disappointed in the last answer you gave, because you declined actually to do what I was hoping you would do and give us a very specific sort of architecture. I mean, we all know the system is too easily gamed. It's absurd that you should have a compliance with the rules when debt is following in the last year, but it's actually higher than it was at the beginning of the period. Surely you can give us some specific ideas of how to bind in genuine reductions earlier in the whole period of the forecast.
I think you can look at what this country has done in the past and what other countries have done are doing at the moment, to make their fiscal rules more binding. One thing is just targeting a level of debt rather than targeting it falling. And like, if you want debt to be lower, then target debt to be lower.
Yeah.
Don't target it to be falling in 5 years' time. I think what other countries also do is they have kind of fiscal rules or fiscal guidelines which are more constraining on the path of the deficit rather than where it needs to be in 2 or 3 years' time. So it's actually more binding on the budget being announced rather than on future budgets. Other countries require kind of misses against the fiscal rules be made up in future years so that you don't just get this kind of upward drift in deficits and upward drift in deficits. So there are mechanisms that one can use. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. But I do think that we've had for some time now in the UK fiscal rules that have been rolling in nature. Yeah. And the thing about rolling fiscal rules is that rolling fiscal rules make sense when you're in equilibrium and you want to stay there. When you're in disequilibrium, what rolling fiscal rules allow you to do is never get there, because you've always got a 2 to 3 year excuse for why you're not there at the moment. Yeah. And so I think the rules that we need rules that are designed for a country which is running a 5% deficit and doesn't want to stay there. And at the moment we've got a set of rules which have allowed the UK to stay there for the last 5 years, while other countries have actually got their deficit down to something more like 2 or 3 in the time available since the last crisis.
Lord Razzle.
Yes, I think Lord Lamont has moved you a little bit further. Could I try and move you even further by asking you what you think when you turn on the Today programme after we produced our report and you listen to our chair, what do you hope his first sentence will be?
to thank Richard Hughes for his valuable contribution to our report.
I really should not put words into this committee's mouth in terms of the recommendations that it wants to make. I mean, I think you've had really great evidence from everybody in front of you. I've learned a lot from it. I think it's great that you've talked to a broad range of voices in the UK. I think it's also great that you've talked to people who work in fiscal councils and fiscal policy making in other countries, because I do think we have a lot to learn from there, especially because fiscal rules and councils now almost universal in Europe, so there's a lot of experience to learn from. And so I wouldn't presume to give you recommendations, but I certainly look forward to turning on the Today programme and hearing what you have to say.
Glad one person does.
When we go off the record, will you tell us?
Well, we have no more questions. Richard, thank you so much. You've taken a huge, wide range of questions, and not just on the OBR, but as you were keen to put out at the beginning, this is an inquiry which looks at the range of issues on the fiscal framework, including but not limited to the OBR. So thank you for stretching the range of the questions we're looking at. We're really grateful, and with that I can declare this meeting closed.